Alexa Sand, Associate Vice President for Research and Professor of Art History at Utah State University. First, I'd really like to thank Chris for inviting me here, and I am so happy to be giving this keynote address to the students of Westminster College. So, here we are, having your undergraduate research symposium online, and I thought I'd talk a little bit about what it means to do research in a time of plague. All of us, literally every single person in the world, is now dealing with the impact of COVID-19 in some way or form. Some of us have lost loved ones, some have lost their lives, some are desperately ill, some are in quarantine, some caring for the sick. So it can feel like the work that one does in ordinary times is a bit irrelevant. But I want to assure you that this is not the case. In fact, continuing to do our work, whether it involves academic research, elementary school teaching, art making, baking bread, designing games, or developing urban housing plans, is an important guarantor of our humanity. This pandemic will pass, and the world that we know on the other side of its passage will be different. But it will still be important for each of us to have a sense of purpose and to contribute to our various communities with our knowledge, our expertise, and our passion. What does it mean for all of us as researchers, scholars, and creative innovators to continue our engagement with our work through this difficult period of physical isolation, emotional stress, and fear? I'm offering my thoughts here in the hope that they will help you, whether you are a student researcher, a mentor, or just someone trying to get work done while your cat naps on your shoulder and your first grader with no keyboarding skills struggles to finish an online module while your toddler hollers for toast. For those of you engaged in STEM research, you may or may not see some immediate applicability of your work to the current pandemic. If you do, that's fantastic, but if you do not, that is also just fine. The ancient Greek physician, Hippocrates, is given credit for the aphorism, "Art is long and life is short." The art of which he spoke was medicine, his point being that the accumulation of healing wisdom takes more than the span of a single human lifetime. Maybe the work you're doing counting insect carapaces in the salt foam of the Great Salt Lake seems a long way off from COVID-19, but it is certainly the case that insights from your work may ultimately become part of a larger conversation that illuminates the insidious effects of climate change or localized pollution that have just as much importance for human health in the long term. For social science-oriented researchers, this pandemic presents an enormous disruption to many of the fundamental techniques and processes that anchor these fields. The work you do with other humans cannot take place face-to-face. Perhaps you've quickly adapted to using technology to substitute for these interactions. Whether or not you have also certainly encountered the limitations of technology, especially if you work with marginalized populations that may or may not have access to reliable internet or computer resources now that public libraries, community and senior centers, and schools are closed. Your work becomes all the more important in this period of social distancing because it will reveal all the more starkly the cracks in the foundational assumptions of the global capitalist economy. One of the great lessons of the humanities, my own intellectual home, is this: we are all in this together. And by this, I mean the human condition, not just COVID-19. Regardless of time, culture, or place, we inhabit human bodies. And as a function of this, we have human brains, so we are susceptible to the forces of things both inside and outside our bodies. Emotions, hormonal surges, disease agents, environmental stressors, and the list goes on. This means that whether we study the religious beliefs of ancient societies in the river valleys of Western Asia, literary responses to the Industrial Revolution, or the paintings of Ming Dynasty scholars, we can make some basic assumptions. Humans are fragile and resilient, both physically and culturally. We adapt, we change, we get aggressive, we express affection, we lust, we grieve, we rejoice, we reflect. The study of the humanities is the study of these ways of being in the world, and it keeps us at once humble and connected, critical virtues in the face of an epidemic. The arts give us another important thing to keep in mind. As much as we are biological beings who also exist in culture, we also live in the space of our imagination, as vital to who we are as the physical bodies and environments and cultures in which we live. When the imaginative body and its environment are allowed to flourish, we are most able to tap into our resilience, compassion, and joy. When they are neglected, we wither as human individuals and societies. The arts are what allow us to process the grief and loss of this pandemic, feel our way through the new world it will shape, and reconnect to one another and rebuild. As a scholar, I studied medieval manuscript illumination, and my period, the 14th century, saw the outbreak of Yersinia pestis, the Black Death, or bubonic plague. Historical epidemiologists estimate that 200 million people in Asia, Europe, and Africa fell prey to this deadly bacterial infection. In central and northern Italy, where, as now, the rate of infection and the death toll were extreme, some historical evidence suggests that as much as 70% of the population in some Italian cities perished. The psychic damage from the epidemic was massive. An entire generation of artists, craftspeople, laborers, scholars, politicians, and scientists was ravaged. The great Italian poet, Francesco Petrarch, writing to his brother Gherardo, the only survivor out of 35 monks at the Carthusian monastery of Montreux, mourned, "Alas, my brother, what shall I say? How shall I begin? Whither shall I turn? On all sides is sorrow, everywhere is fear. I would, my brother, that I had never been born, or at least had died before these times." When I imagine Gherardo receiving this letter, alone with his dog, guarding the house on a cliff above the sea he had so recently shared with his brethren, my heart really breaks. His brother's despair can only have echoed and amplified what he was experiencing, a sense of isolation and hopelessness familiar to all of us dealing with COVID-19 today. Meanwhile, Petrarch's contemporary Giovanni Boccaccio, in his literary response to the epidemic, the Decameron, brought together a community of fictional storytellers in a setting of social isolation. The point of this gathering, he explains in his prologue, quote, "To take pity on people in distress is a human quality which every man and woman should possess, but it is especially requisite in those who have once needed comfort and found it in others." End quote. The power of this message strikes me as the reverse side of the coin handed us by Petrarch's letter to his brother. Acknowledging both of these realities, the pain and the potential for comfort is critical now, as it was in the 14th century. Boccaccio's call for compassion should be foremost in our minds as we move through the weeks and months to come. And while each of us has a duty to others, one that for the moment largely consists of staying home and avoiding participating in the spread of the virus as best we can, that does not mean that we need to give up on our other commitments. Part of compassion is self-kindness, and if your research or creative work is what makes it worth it for you to get out of bed in the morning, do not stop. Maybe you cannot get into your lab, or interact with the kindergarten class you've been studying, or join your collaborators in the rehearsal space, but there is still work to be done. As for me, I'm catching up on recent literature in my field and spending a lot of time going through old notes. A friend of mine, who is a chemist, is mining her unpublished data sets and working with her grad students to churn out some papers. Another friend organized a series of virtual poetry slams, and so on. Life is short, that's true, but art, and by that I mean the things we practice with knowledge and skill and curiosity and passion. Art is not only long, but it is sustaining. Thank you, and welcome to a great event that celebrates your learning and your accomplishment.